In American political mythology, there is no symbol more potent than the log cabin. We have turned it into a secular temple, a shrine to the ideal of the self-made man. But for Abraham Lincoln, the cabin wasn't a campaign slogan. It was a cage of poverty and isolation.
February 12, 1809, Sinking Spring Farm, Kentucky. Within a 16 by 18-foot space, a child was born onto a floor of packed earth. There was no window, only a small opening covered with greased paper or animal skin to let in a ghost of light.
His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a man of iron muscle and limited vision. He was a pioneer who saw the world through the lens of survival and manual labor. To Thomas, a book was a distraction. A plow was a tool of destiny. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, remains a shadow in the historical record. Described as deeply religious and intellectually superior to her surroundings, she was the first to plant the seeds of curiosity in a boy who lived in a world of silence.
The log cabin fetish suggests a cozy, rustic upbringing. The reality was brutal. The Lincolns were squatters on the land, constantly moving as titles failed and debts rose. From Kentucky to Indiana, the frontier was a place where nature tried to kill you every single day.
In the winter of 1816, the family lived in a half-faced camp, a three-sided shed with one side open to the elements. They slept on leaves, huddled together for warmth against the Indiana frost. This was the pioneer spirit, stripped of its romantic veneer.
Lincoln would later describe his education as picked up. He attended blab schools, where students recited lessons aloud to prove they were studying. His total formal schooling amounted to less than 12 months across his entire childhood.
But the lack of a teacher didn't mean a lack of learning. Lincoln developed an insatiable, almost pathological hunger for the written word. He would walk 20 miles just to borrow a book, reading by the flickering orange light of the hearth until his eyes burned. At age 9, the darkness deepened. His mother, Nancy, died of milk sickness after consuming poisoned cow's milk. Abraham watched his father carve a coffin from green cherry logs. The boy who would later preserve the Union learned about the finality of loss in the dirt of Indiana. The arrival of his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, saved him. She brought with her a chest of books and, more importantly, the recognition that Abraham was not meant for the plow. She protected his reading time from the demands of a father who thought his son was lazy. By his teens, Lincoln was a physical anomaly. 6'4", all sinew and bone, he could outlift and outchop any man in the county. He became a rail splitter by necessity, clearing the land that his father didn't own, his body becoming a machine of labor. Lincoln hated this life. He didn't cherish the cabin. He despised the ignorance and the backbreaking futility of it. He spent his youth planning his escape, using the law and the English language as his ladder out of the mud.
Decades later, his political handlers would package this misery as a brand. They called him the rail splitter to appeal to the common man. Lincoln participated in the charade, but he rarely spoke of his childhood. To him, it was a stinted time, a period of the short and simple annals of the poor. The log cabin fetish obscures the most impressive part of the story. Lincoln didn't succeed because of his humble beginnings, but in spite of them. He wasn't a product of the frontier. He was its most successful fugitive. To understand the man who saved the Union, you must first understand the man who couldn't save his own general store. Before he was the Great Emancipator, Abraham Lincoln was a professional loser, a man who seemed to have a specialized degree in failure and misfortune. In the early 1830s, Lincoln partnered with a friend to open a general store in New Salem, Illinois. It was a disaster. His partner died, leaving a mountain of debt that Lincoln jokingly referred to as the national debt. It took him 17 years of backbreaking work to pay off every cent. When the business collapsed, the authorities didn't care about his potential. They seized his horse and his surveying instruments. Imagine the future president of the United States walking everywhere on foot because he was too poor to own a mule. His political career began with a thud.
In 1832, he ran for the Illinois General Assembly and finished 8th out of 13 candidates. He didn't even have a formal education or a powerful family name to fall back on. He was simply a tall, awkward man with a high-pitched voice and a losing record.
Then came the personal losses. The death of Anne Rutledge, his first great love, plunged him into a depression so deep that friends feared he would take his own life. He was a man who walked the woods at night, mourning a future that seemed to have died before it even began. Despite the setbacks, Lincoln had an insatiable hunger for growth. He didn't go to law school, he couldn't afford it. Instead, he borrowed law books and read them by the flickering light of a fireplace after working 12 hours of manual labor. He was literally a self-taught failure who refused to accept his station in life.
By the 1840s, he finally made it to Congress, but even that felt like a defeat. He was a one-term wonder. His opposition to the Mexican-American War was so unpopular that he didn't even seek re-election. He returned to Springfield, Illinois, believing his political life was over at age 40.
The mid-1850s brought the most stinging defeats. In 1854, he sought a seat in the U.S. Senate. He led for several ballots, but eventually had to step aside and give his votes to a colleague to prevent a pro-slavery candidate from winning. He sacrificed his own ambition for his principles, yet remained a loser in the eyes of the public. In 1856, he tried for the vice presidential nomination. He failed again. It seemed as though every time he reached for the stars, the ladder was kicked out from under him. But Lincoln's secret weapon was his melancholy. It gave him a grim, stoic resilience that others lacked.
The most famous failure came in 1858 during the legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln held his own against the little giant, Stephen Douglas, in a series of grueling intellectual battles over the soul of the nation. He won the popular vote, but because of how the legislature worked, he lost the election.
Imagine the toll. By 1859, Lincoln was a man who had lost his business, lost his sweetheart, lost multiple state elections, and lost 2 bids for the U.S. Senate. To his neighbors, he was Honest Abe, a decent lawyer with a tragic streak of bad luck.
But these losses were his forge. Every failed campaign taught him how to read the public mood. Every bankruptcy taught him the value of $1 and the plight of the working man. He wasn't failing. He was apprenticing for the most difficult job in human history.
When the 1860 Republican National Convention arrived, Lincoln was the dark horse. He wasn't the favorite. He was the man who was least offensive because he hadn't been in power long enough to make major enemies. His history of losing made him the perfect, unassuming compromise candidate.
The professional loser had finally found his moment. He won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. He was a minority president in a divided House, mocked by the elite as an illiterate prairie lawyer who was destined to fail one last spectacular time.
Lincoln's life teaches us that failure is not a destination. It is a prerequisite. He didn't succeed despite his losses. He succeeded because of them. He was a man comfortable with defeat, which made him the only person capable of leading a nation through its greatest catastrophe.
To truly understand the man, we must look past the somber marble statue and the stoic face on the $5 bill. Abraham Lincoln was a mass of fascinating, often bizarre contradictions that humanized the legend.
Standing at 6'4", Lincoln was a physical titan for his era, towering over most men. Long before he wrestled with the fate of the Union, he was literally wrestling men into the dirt in the backwoods of Illinois. He wasn't just a casual brawler, he was a legitimate champion of the frontier. Historical records suggest Lincoln lost only 1 out of approximately 300 matches, a record that eventually earned him a spot in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. His most famous bout was against Jack Armstrong, the leader of a local gang called the Clary's Grove Boys. When Armstrong tried to foul him, Lincoln grabbed the bully by the throat and shook him like a rag doll.
But when this wrestling giant opened his mouth to speak, the sound that emerged shocked his audience. Instead of a booming baritone, Lincoln possessed a high-pitched, almost squeaky, reedy tenor voice.
The initial reaction from crowds was often a mixture of laughter and confusion. Yet, as he spoke, His sharp logic and rhythmic delivery would cast a spell, making listeners completely forget the strange pitch of his voice.
Then there was the iconic stovepipe hat. While it added nearly a foot to his height, making him an unmistakable figure in any crowd, the hat served a purpose far beyond mere fashion or vanity.
Lincoln used his hat as a mobile filing cabinet. Inside the silk lining, he tucked away urgent letters, legal briefs, and drafts of speeches, keeping his most vital thoughts literally on his mind at all times.
Observers often joked that if you wanted to steal the nation's secrets, you didn't need to break into a safe. You just had to knock the president's hat off his head during a walk through Washington.
Lincoln's mind was also deeply mechanical. He remains the only U.S. president to ever hold a patent, specifically for a system of inflatable bellows designed to lift boats over shallow river shoals.
This invention was born from his early days as a flatboatman on the Mississippi. He knew the frustration of getting stuck on a sandbar and spent years tinkering with models to solve the problem of river navigation.
Despite his logical and mathematical mind, Lincoln was surprisingly superstitious. He believed in the power of dreams and reportedly had a vivid premonition of his own assassination just days before it occurred.
In the chaos of the Civil War, he found solace in animals. He was obsessed with cats, once feeding a stray with a gold fork at a state dinner, much to the horror of his sophisticated guests.
He was a master of the tall tale. Lincoln used humor as a strategic weapon, telling self-deprecating jokes to disarm political enemies or to relieve the crushing emotional stress of the war. The nickname Honest Abe was earned long before politics. As a young clerk, he once walked miles after closing his shop to return a few cents to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. His physical prowess wasn't just for wrestling. He could swing an axe with such precision that he became legendary as the rail splitter, a man who literally carved his own path out of the wilderness. These quirks, the squeaky voice, the hat full of papers, and the wrestling rings, reveal a man who was deeply human and approachable, yet profoundly extraordinary in his complexity. By embracing his eccentricities, Lincoln managed to connect with the common man while leading them through the darkest chapter in history, proving that true greatness often wears a very strange hat.
To truly understand Abraham Lincoln, we must look past the cold marble of the Lincoln Memorial and the stiff, stoic portraits. Beneath the weight of the Union, there was a man of peculiar habits and unexpected talents. Before he was a politician, Lincoln was a formidable physical specimen. Standing at 6'4", he was a giant of his time, possessing a reach and strength that made him a legend on the Illinois frontier. This physical prowess led him to the wrestling ring. Long before he debated Stephen Douglas, he was grappling with the toughest men in New Salem. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a testament to his grit. His record was staggering. Out of approximately 300 matches, Honest Abe lost only once. His skill was so renowned that he was eventually inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, a secret side of his legacy few know. Then there is the matter of his voice. Modern cinema often portrays him with a deep, booming baritone, a voice that commands the room with its gravity. But history tells a different story. Contemporary accounts describe Lincoln's voice as surprisingly high-pitched, even reedy or shrill. It was a tenor that carried across wide plains and crowded halls, piercing through the noise of political rallies. While the tone might have been jarring at first, his delivery was mesmerizing. Once he began to speak, the strange pitch was forgotten, replaced by the sheer power of his logic and the rhythm of his prose. Perhaps his most iconic accessory was the silk stovepipe hat. While it added to his already imposing height, it served a purpose far more practical than simple fashion.
Lincoln used his hat as a mobile filing cabinet. Inside the lining, he would tuck away important letters, legal briefs, and drafts of the speeches that would eventually change the course of history.
The haberdashery of secrets meant that if you wanted to find the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation or a private letter to a general, you might just find it stowed safely above his brow. Beyond law and wrestling, Lincoln possessed the mind of an engineer. He was a man fascinated by how things worked,
always looking for mechanical solutions to everyday problems.
This curiosity led him to become the only U.S. president to ever hold a patent. Registered as number 6469, his invention was a device designed to lift boats over shoals and river obstructions.
Though the device was never manufactured, it represents a core part of his character, a tireless problem solver who believed that ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, whether it be a riverbed or a divided nation.
These curiosities, the wrestler, the tenor, the inventor with the secret hat, humanize the legend. They remind us that the man who saved democracy was not a mythic god, but a deeply eccentric and multifaceted human being.
It was this collection of strange traits and hidden depths that allowed him to connect with the common man while navigating the most complex crisis in American history.
By understanding the secrets in his hat and the strength in his grip, we see a more complete picture of the 16th president, a man whose quirks were just as essential as his convictions. To his admirers, he is the savior of the Union. To his detractors in 1861, Abraham Lincoln was something far more dangerous, a constitutional vandal who tore up the rulebook of American law in the name of national survival. The crisis began in Maryland. If the state seceded, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by enemy territory. Lincoln knew he couldn't wait for the slow gears of the judiciary to turn while the capital was at risk.
In a move that shocked the legal establishment, Lincoln unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. This meant the government could throw citizens into military prisons indefinitely without ever charging them with a crime. Chief Justice Roger Taney challenged the president directly in the case of Ex parte Merryman, ruling that only Congress had the power to suspend the writ. Lincoln simply ignored the Supreme Court, a move that bordered on a coup d'etat. Lincoln's justification was a brutal logic. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? He argued he had to break the Constitution to save it. The crackdown wasn't limited to soldiers. Over 13,000 civilians were arrested. Newspaper editors who dared to criticize the war effort found their offices shuttered and their printing presses seized by the military. The most famous victim was Clement Vallandigham, a congressman and Copperhead who spoke against the war. Lincoln had him arrested for disloyal sentiments and eventually banished him to the Confederacy. Beyond civil liberties, Lincoln's moral legacy is complicated by his early views on race. For years, he advocated for colonization, the idea that freed slaves should be moved to Africa or Central America rather than integrated. In 1862, he wrote to Horace Greeley, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." To Lincoln, the preservation of the democratic experiment always took precedence over the plight of the enslaved, at least initially. He also used the military to influence elections. In the 1864 election, soldiers were given furloughs to go home and vote for Lincoln, while in occupied territories, those who wouldn't take a loyalty oath were barred from the polls. Critics called him King Abraham I and the Illinois Ape. Political cartoons of the era depicted him as a tyrant, trampling on the Bill of Rights while smoking a pipe made of human bones. Even the Emancipation Proclamation was technically an extra-constitutional use of war powers. He framed it not as a civil rights act, but as a fit and necessary war measure to seize enemy property, the enslaved people themselves. When the draft riots turned New York City into a war zone, Lincoln didn't hesitate. He sent combat troops, fresh from Gettysburg, to fire on American citizens in the streets to restore order at any cost. His administration also controlled the flow of information. The War Department took over the telegraph lines, creating the first modern system of government censorship in American history. Yet this vandalism of the Constitution was arguably the only thing that kept the United States from vanishing. Lincoln took the sins of the nation onto his own shoulders, risking his soul to save the state. The question remains for every generation. Is a leader a tyrant for breaking the law to save the people, or is the law more important than the people it was designed to protect? At the onset of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's primary objective was not the liberation of 4 million souls, but the preservation of a singular, fractured union. He was a lawyer by trade,
bound by a constitution that legally protected slavery in the southern states, and he feared that any radical move toward abolition would drive the critical border states into the arms of the Confederacy. Lincoln's personal morality often clashed with his political pragmatism. He famously stated, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Yet he felt he had no constitutional authority to strike at the institution where it already existed. In 1861, he was not the Great Emancipator, but a cautious executive walking a razor-thin tightrope.
For years, Lincoln's solution to the problem of slavery was one that modern history finds deeply uncomfortable: colonization. He entertained the idea of freed slaves voluntarily emigrating to Liberia or Central America, believing that deep-seated racial prejudices in the U.S. would prevent a peaceful, integrated society.
The reluctant abolitionist was pushed by the grim reality of the battlefield. As Union casualties mounted, Lincoln realized that the Confederacy's greatest resource was its enslaved labor force, which grew the food and built the fortifications that kept the rebel army fighting. To win the war, he had to dismantle the engine of the Southern economy.
Radical Republicans in Congress and abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass were constant thorns in Lincoln's side. Douglass blasted the president for his hesitation, calling him the slow-moving machinery of the government. Lincoln listened, debated, and waited, knowing that the public's heart was not yet ready for a total social revolution. In August 1862, Lincoln wrote a public letter to Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. He stated, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." This was a masterclass in political cover, preparing the public for what he had already secretly decided to do. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. He presented it to his cabinet in July, but Secretary of State William Seward gave him crucial advice: wait for a military victory. To issue it after a string of Union defeats would look like an act of desperation, a last shriek on the retreat. The opportunity came in September at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Though the battle was a tactical draw, it was enough of a victory to give Lincoln the political capital he needed. The war was no longer just about geography, it was becoming a crusade. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It gave the rebel states 100 days to return to the Union, or their slaves would be declared then, thenceforward, and forever free. It was a final ultimatum. A bridge burned behind him. The proclamation was a legalistic document, devoid of the soaring rhetoric of the Gettysburg Address. It was written as a fit and necessary war measure, designed to withstand a challenge in the Supreme Court. Yet its impact was seismic, instantly changing the status of millions within the eyes of the Union Army. When January 1, 1863 arrived, Lincoln's hand was sore from shaking hundreds of hands at a New Year's reception. As he picked up the pen to sign the final document, he paused. He said, "If my soul is not in this act, I am wrong." He steadied his hand, for he did not want his signature to appear shaky to future generations. The reluctant abolitionist had finally crossed the Rubicon. By making the war about slavery, he effectively ended any chance of Britain or France intervening on behalf of the South. European empires could not justify supporting a slave power against a nation fighting for human liberty.
One of the most radical provisions of the proclamation was the invitation for black men to join the Union military. Lincoln, who once doubted their role, now saw them as the great available asset. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served, proving their citizenship through blood.
Lincoln knew the proclamation was vulnerable. It was an executive order that could be overturned after the war. This realization transformed the reluctant abolitionist into a fierce political warrior. He spent his final months obsessively lobbying for the 13th Amendment to permanently ban slavery from the Constitution. By the time of his second inaugural address, the transition was complete. Lincoln no longer spoke of saving the Union in cold, legal terms. He spoke of the war as a divine punishment for the offense of slavery. suggesting that every drop of blood drawn with the lash must be paid by another drawn with the sword. Abraham Lincoln did not begin his journey as a crusader, but his capacity for growth made him one. He was a man who allowed his conscience to be educated by the horrors of war and the persistence of the oppressed. The man who once hesitated ended his life as the martyr of freedom.
November 19, 1863. The small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, is shrouded in a somber autumn chill, still reeling from the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil just 4 months prior. The ground was still scarred. Thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers had been buried in shallow, hasty graves, and the purpose of this gathering was to dedicate a final resting place for the fallen. The featured speaker was not Lincoln, but Edward Everett, the most celebrated orator of the age. He spoke for 2 hours, delivering a massive 13,000-word academic masterpiece on the history of the war. President Lincoln had been invited almost as an afterthought, asked only to provide a few appropriate remarks to formally set apart the grounds at the end of the ceremony. Contrary to the myth that he scribbled it on a scrap of paper on the train, Lincoln had been meticulously crafting his words, agonizing over the rhythm and weight of every single syllable. As he stood to speak, Lincoln was actually quite ill, suffering from the early stages of smallpox. He was lightheaded and weak, yet he commanded the attention of 15,000 people present. He began not with the current conflict, but by looking back to 1776. 77 years ago, he said, invoking the Declaration of Independence rather than the Constitution. In just 10 sentences, he reframed the entire American Civil War. It was no longer just a fight to save the Union. It was a supreme test of whether democracy itself could survive.
His voice, described as a high-pitched and reedy, carried across the silent fields as he told the crowd that the living could not truly dedicate or hallow this ground.
The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. He was humoring the limits of political rhetoric in the face of sacrifice. Lincoln then pivoted to the unfinished work that remained. He called on the nation to take increased devotion to the cause, for which the soldiers gave the last full measure of devotion.
The speech reached its crescendo with a vision for the future, a new birth of freedom that would finally align the nation's reality with its founding ideals.
That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he sat down after only 2 minutes, the reaction was stunned silence. There was no thunderous applause. Lincoln turned to his friend, Ward Hill Lamon, and said, "Lamon, that speech won't scour." The next day, Edward Everett wrote to him, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes."
Before the Gettysburg Address, people said the United States are. After these 272 words, they began to say the United States is. He had linguistically and spiritually fused the country together.
Lincoln's few appropriate remarks became the American scripture. In 2 minutes, he gave the dead a meaning and the living a mission that still defines the nation today. Abraham Lincoln did not just lead through a period of national darkness, he lived in a state of personal darkness. Today, we call it clinical depression, but in the 19th century, it was known as melancholy, a heavy, suffocating cloud that followed him from the frontier to the White House. His misery was not a single event, but a cumulative weight. It began with the death of his mother when he was 9, followed by his sister, and later, the devastating loss of his first love, Anne Rutledge. These early tragedies wired his brain to expect sorrow. His friends were often terrified for his life. During his darkest episodes in New Salem, they removed knives, razors, and even ropes from his reach, fearing he would succumb to the urge to end his own suffering. He was a man literally haunted by his own mind. What is remarkable is not that Lincoln was depressed, but that he used this misery as a forge. He believed that his suffering had to have a purpose,
and that purpose was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Lincoln famously said he had an insatiable ambition to be truly esteemed by his fellow men. This wasn't vanity, it was survival. He felt that if he died without leaving the world a better place, his life of pain would have been a meaningless tragedy.
This melancholy gave him a superpower, a profound, bone-deep empathy. Because he knew what it was like to feel broken, he could feel the pulse of a broken nation. He didn't look at the casualties of war as statistics, he felt them as personal losses.
During the war, he suffered from chronic insomnia. He was the ghost of the White House, pacing the halls at 3 a.m., wrapped in a shawl, reading Shakespeare's tragedies to find some reflection of his own inner turmoil.
He used humor as a desperate shield. His legendary storytelling and wit were not signs of a happy man, but the survival instincts of a sad one. He once said, "I laugh because I must not weep. That's all. That's all."
When his son Willie died in the White House in 1862, Lincoln's grief nearly shattered the Union. He would shut himself in a room every Thursday to weep, yet he still managed to sign the Emancipation Proclamation and lead the military effort.
The physical toll was visible to everyone. Between 1861 and 1865, he aged decades. His face became a map of the war. Deep lines, sunken cheeks, and a gaze that seemed to look right through the present and into eternity. This misery fueled his malice toward none philosophy. He didn't hate the South because he understood that human struggle was universal. His pain had burned away his ego, leaving only a drive for justice and reconciliation.
Lincoln's life teaches us that greatness does not require a clear mind or a happy heart. He was fueled by his own misery, transforming a personal hell into a national salvation, proving that the heaviest burdens can produce the strongest leaders.